Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Why is it that sexual pleasure is so elusive? As soon as we try to receive sexual pleasure, get an orgasm, suddenly it's gone. We don't have the ability to feel that sexual pleasure anymore. We are going to be talking about why sexual pleasure is so elusive and how we can work with that elusiveness and why it's actually a really, really good thing. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the sex and intimacy podcast for Catholic women. My name is Ellen Holloway. I am a Catholic speaker and coach who specializes in sex and marital intimacy, and I am on a mission to help you actually enjoy and desire good, holy sex with your spouse. So today we're talking about sexual pleasure and why it seems like as soon as you try to get sexual pleasure, then suddenly it's gone. I hear this a lot. And honestly, this is a big reason why I created the orgasm course that I have, is because so many women, particularly Catholic women, a lot of, especially those of us who have struggled with like a purity culture mindset, things like that. So many Catholic women struggle with sexual pleasure and with orgasm. And so why? It's something that is good. We know it's good. God created it. Women have an organ that is only for sexual pleasure. Men don't have that, right? The women have the clitoris. The only function of the clitoris is sexual pleasure, right? So we know that it's a good thing. We know that it is something that God wanted and desired, right? We don't have to have the clitoris. Like if the clitoris didn't exist in our body, we would still, it doesn't perform any other function, right? We don't need the clitoris to be living. And so, but why is it so elusive? Why does it just disappear? I actually see this a lot, is that like a lot of women have more luck getting an orgasm, getting sexual pleasure, if you try really hard not to get one, right? Because sexual pleasure it's so elusive that if you're focusing too much on it, it just goes by the wayside. I want you to think about sexual pleasure kind of like a rainbow. We can see a rainbow, but you can't hold a rainbow. You can't touch a rainbow, right? It's there. We know that it exists, but it's not something that we can go and get. It's not something that we can hold in our hand. That's sexual pleasure. Sexual pleasure is collateral to human action. This is from Karol Wojtyla in Love and Responsibility. Love and Responsibility is the book that Karol Wojtyla is Pope John Paul II before he became Pope, obviously. He wrote Love and Responsibility when he was a bishop. And this book was kind of a culmination of a lot of the work that he had done with couples as like a parish priest. And he worked very closely. He was good friends with so many like married couples, and he counseled married couples and helped them in their faith journey and just in their marital issues. He really became like a lover of human love. And Love and Responsibility is this kind of explanation of human love and how we are to approach human love. It is a beautiful book. It is also a super philosophical book, so it can be a little tough to read. But this collateralness of sexual pleasure is what I want to talk about in this episode. So Karol Wojtyla, this is toward the beginning of Love and Responsibility. He's just kind of talking about how pleasure, not even sexual pleasure, just pleasure in itself, is not the proper end of human action. Right? So if we are going into an action seeking pleasure, we are missing the mark on the goal here. The pleasure is collateral, meaning that collateral, if we look at the etymology of it, co meaning with, and then lateral meaning like in another line. Like if you think about lateral lines, they're next to each other. So collateral means that it goes along with human action, but it isn't in the same line as human action. It's lateral to it. It's collateral. It's alongside it.
We'll be back with the episode in just a minute.
Are you struggling with sexual pleasure or just really feeling connected with your husband during sex? I would argue that foreplay is probably the culprit here. Foreplay is wildly important, but not something that we're ever really taught how to do or what to do. And that is why I created a completely free 5-day Foreplay Foundations course for you. Head to vinesandfullbloom.com/foreplay or click the link in the show notes for the completely free 5-day Foreplay Foundations course. Pleasure is elusive because it is collateral. Because it is not the proper end of human action, pleasure is elusive. When we point our end of an action at pleasure, that's when it starts becoming elusive. And that's also when we start missing the mark. Just like the rainbow. If our goal is to go and get the rainbow and hold on to it, the rainbow becomes insanely elusive. But if instead we enjoy the rainbow and we look at the rainbow, we take in the rainbow, then it's not elusive. We can see it even clearer. It's beautiful. And we can glory in God's creation and remember his promises by seeing the rainbow. But if we love how beautiful the rainbow is and we're trying to hold it, we're trying to have it in our pocket, we can't. And that's sexual pleasure. We can't go grasping for sexual pleasure because one of two things will happen. The first, which is what we're talking about today, is that it'll just disappear. It's so elusive because it's not supposed to be the end of our actions. The other thing that could happen is we start sinning. If pleasure is the end of human action, if pleasure is the end of a sexual encounter, then the other person becomes the means. And another person cannot be the means to an end. A person is an end in and of himself. This is also something that Karol Wojtyla talks about in Love and Responsibility. When we're seeking pleasure first and foremost, and the other person becomes a means to that pleasure, we are using that person. And use, Karol Wojtyla argues, is the opposite of love. So if pleasure is not the proper end of human action, what then is the proper end of human action? Love, right? And then that pleasure comes collaterally with the loving action. All right, so why is it such a good thing then that pleasure is elusive? Because if you're listening to this and you're like, I've never experienced sexual pleasure, and you keep telling me that sexual pleasure is really good, and now you just spent like 8 minutes telling me how sexual pleasure is really elusive and I shouldn't try to go get it, you're probably like trying to pull your hair out. You're like, Ellen, stop contradicting yourself. I'm not contradicting myself. Pleasure is, in fact, a very, very, very good thing. And I want you to experience sexual pleasure. The elusiveness of sexual pleasure is so good because it helps us to make sure that we are not using another person, that we're not using our spouse. Because again, if we're going directly for that pleasure and we're grasping at that pleasure is becoming the end and the person is becoming the means. And now that's use. If we allow pleasure to be that collateral thing, if we allow the rainbow to exist and we don't try to pick up the rainbow and put it in our pocket, if we allow it to exist, but the end is love, we are coming together with our husband in a loving action. And our goal is to give of ourselves to our husband in a loving way. Then that pleasure is able to freely come collaterally with that loving action. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.